gentlemen, I'm with Clay McColloer of Knight and Stone today. Clay, I appreciate you taking time to join us.
You bet. Thank you very much.
This segment of Businessman on the Street. And we're going to be talking about, you're going to make a presentation in connection with the Woodlands Chamber in one of their educational series. So tell me a little bit about that particular program.
Sure. It's going to be May 23rd from 9 to 11 in the morning at the offices of the Chamber here in the Woodlands. We're going to talk about entity formation and liability and the liabilities that exist within and around certain entity structures, and really how to protect the owners and the managers of those entities from those liabilities.
Well, that sounds like a very important topic. My first question would be, if it's about formation, if I'm already in business and I have an entity, tell me what's valuable or could be valuable for me to attend the seminar.
Well, it depends. So really what we look at is the entity structure for asset protection? Is it there for protecting the operations of the entity? Or maybe there's tax considerations that you may not want to be in a certain entity. Maybe you want to be in a different entity structure. And so there's ways around that. We'll kind of talk about those generally, but those are certainly deep, specific questions. But certainly those are considerations that we need to think about.
You know, you mentioned questions, and that's one of the things I really feel is great about the series that the Woodlands Chamber put on, is that there's always a good period of time left for questions. So if you're thinking about attending this seminar, come with some questions that you might have about your entity, your structure, things you might have heard. The recent Tax Act, I know, changed some tax considerations.
Definitely.
They had a program about that at the Chamber earlier this year. So I think there's a reason to check in on my entity from time to time. Do you have any advice to someone how often they should take a look, talk to their attorney, possibly CPA about their entity?
Well, certainly every year you're going to talk to your accountant, and so that's certainly a good time to sit down and talk about not only where you currently are in your business, but really where you want to be. Sometimes we talk about exit strategies. Maybe you want to transfer your equity in a business to the next generation. Maybe you want to think about merging with a company. And so we need to think about structure. How are you structured? Because there's certain structures that are favorable to mergers, whether that be with a public company, another private entity. So some of those things that we're going to talk about relate to that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I know in my practice of mentoring and advising people is that if you're going to start your exit strategy, if I have my preference, starts when you first day in business. But if you're mature and been in business for a while, don't wait till the very end, right, to have those discussions.
Usually we recommend 2 to 3 years out is really when you need to start thinking about that. And with small businesses, typically, they run a lot of personal assets through the business, which isn't necessarily wrong, but that's not very favorable when you're trying to sell a business or transition a business. So those are things you need to think about. Certainly, we want to make sure that the structure is correct for what you're doing. Maybe it's a high risk, high liability industry that you're in. We want to make sure you're in the right structure. And so those things evolve over time, but it's best day one before you form your entity, or you're thinking about getting into business, or you're thinking about owning real property. Well, it's better to own that within an entity or certain types of entities, and we'll certainly talk about that in the presentation.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. I had a client recently who built up a business over 15 years, wonderful business. And they got down to the exit part, and even though we talked on an ongoing basis, they never pulled the trigger, if you will, to make it happen.
Right.
And then they end up, they're not going to be able to sell their business based on that they want to exit, and there's certain reasons for that. So you end up at the end and you're holding the bag, right, so to speak.
Well, and I think our job as attorneys is to really set the entity up and make sure that the owners are comfortable with the structure. An owner's highest and best use is whatever operations that they're going into, whether that be manufacturing, professional services. They don't need to worry about the legal side, but they do day one. They need to make sure that it's structured properly. Do you have all the right documents in place? Did you set up a corporate bank account? Do you have a company agreement if it's an LLC? Do you have bylaws if it's a corporation? If it's a corporation, have you had annual meetings? These are things that typically in small businesses aren't occurring, and we're finding that to be very problematic, because if they get sued, they think, oh, I'm a limited liability company. I have limited liability. There's no way they can come after me personally. They can. And our job is to make sure from day one you're set up so that that doesn't happen.
And you set up and maintain.
That's right. That's right.
That's very important, I think, based on, again, some personal experience, yes, working with some clients. Well, let me ask you this. Right now, 2019, What's the most popular entity choice for small businesses or people who are trying to form small
It's
businesses?
typically the LLC. I call them corporations by contract. LLC is a very small threshold to set up with the state of Texas, but the beauty is you can run it as a true corporation. You can have CEOs and presidents. You can make it really flat. You can make it very easy to manage with just members or managers. And it's very fluid. It doesn't require annual meetings like a traditional corporation does, so it's easier for the business owner to focus on their core competency. And so we typically utilize the LLC. Obviously, corporations, limited partnerships, a little bit more tricky. And again, in the presentation, we'll talk about that.
Well, let me ask you this. If I do choose the LLC, which is what I see in my practice, what disadvantages are there potentially in the LLC choice?
Really, there's very few. It's really hard to mess up the LLC in terms of its structure. What we find is that people will have maybe somebody will go out and set it up on their own, or they'll utilize an online service. Well, the problem with that is every state mandates a minimum set of requirements to set the entity up. But that's not enough to really protect you individually from liability. And so that's where we see a lot of people make mistakes is, well, I'll spend a little bit of money online, I'll set this entity up, and I'm good to go. Well, that's not really the case. There's a lot more to it. We see a lot of issues with contracts not being signed properly in terms of, are you a manager of an LLC? Are you a member of an LLC? And really the interaction of, are you going to add people in the future, right? We want to make sure we understand the full game plan. That's where a lot of people mess up. And with an LLC, we can create that structure up front. So if you spend time with your attorney and say, here's kind of where I want to go with that, we can set that up from day one so that you're not back in our office, every year having to amend a document. And so I think at the end of the day, that's really the downside of the LLC is there's such a small threshold to set it up, but most people don't understand, well, there's a few other requirements needed to make sure that you're focused in the right direction.
What I hear you saying, I think it's important. It's simple on its face, but don't let that fool you.
Right.
And I think that's wise advice to people, because reality is if you're going to start a business, I would assume your intention is to build the business and either sell it or somehow monetize it. And if you don't do it right in the beginning, and it's for a little extra time, a little extra money, then at the end of the
Well, there's tax considerations, and that's what a lot of people don't understand is with the LLC, it's very flexible. We can do a double taxation like a corporation. We can do a pass-through like a partnership. There's a thing called an S-corp that people get very confused on. And so those are things that we need to go through and make sure is it set up properly, right? Depending upon cash flow, depending upon how much you may pay yourself, if you own it 100% in terms of the entity, there are certain things that we can do on the tax side that are very beneficial to you. Make sure that we set it up as an LLC. We don't have those advantages necessarily with a corporation or maybe a limited partnership. So again, the LLC is the most flexible entity. That's why we see it. But the downside is people don't understand, that there's a little bit more than the minimum requirements to set it up. Come talk to us, talk to an attorney, make sure that you set it up properly from day one, and then you really don't have to worry about, personal liability and things like that within the business.
Yeah, and I think what I hear, it's most important to, and I'm conveying, and why a program like this is so valuable, is that the entity formation or the type of entity you choose to operate under, it's an important part of your business. I mean, yes, you might only do it once and then build your business over 20 plus years, and it works. But from time to time, you need to be checking it. I always advise my clients to talk to their attorney once a year, just to have a conversation about what their business is doing, what it's about, not just for the entity, but for other considerations. I think that's very important, but so many folks overlook it. How can you encourage, or how would you encourage people to do this? I mean, to spend the time and effort and do the right entity and then maintain it.
Well, it's like most of us go to the doctor every year and we get a checkup. It's the same thing with an entity. Give us a call once a year. Spend 30 minutes on the phone saying, hey, Clay, here's where we are. Here's where we want to go next year. Do we need to consider anything, right? Or we're going to add more people. We're going to add new investors. Are they passive investors? Are they going to be active members in the company? Those things all dictate structure. They dictate tax considerations. So we need to kind of sit there and see where you're going. The worst thing to do is to call an attorney after the fact and say, hey, we just acquired a company, or hey, we just hired 50 individuals. Okay, well, that would have been nice to know beforehand, because it can be a lot easier to change structure or change, tax considerations than after the fact. And so really, once a year, spend half an hour with your attorney, kind of doing that same thing you would with yourself, going to the doctors, just to check up.
Right.
Here's where we were, here's where we're at, and here's where we want to go. And that attorney can really help you. A seasoned attorney can certainly help you with structure, and making sure you don't miss something along the way. It's better to be proactive than reactive. Reactive costs a lot more money than being proactive, to be quite honest.
There is no doubt about that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will consider coming to this workshop. I think there's a lot you can learn, taking a couple hours out of your day. At least it would hopefully generate your interest to be a little more involved with your entity. And Clay, you want to give people the detail about where it is one more time?
Sure. Again, it's May 23rd from 9 to 11 at the Woodlands Chamber's offices.
Clay McColloer, really appreciate you taking time to be with us on Businessman on the Street. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much.
OneBestConsult.com, a community of small business owners where you as an owner can find answers to the most pressing business questions you have. Not sure who to turn to when you have a challenge in your business? Turn to the folks at OneBestConsult.com. That's the number one, bestconsult.com, where you can always find advice you can use based on common sense business experience. Join our community of like-minded business owners at OneBestConsult.com.